Metamedia presents New Horizons, conscious conversations for inner exploration and awakening with leading minds in the arts, sciences, astrology, and spirituality.
A number of people over the last few months have been asking me about why I don't do a podcast, and thought about it for a while and decided I don't know why I don't do a podcast, which means why not do one? So I want to introduce you to the two of us who are making this thing happen, and the third person who isn't in the room right now, who is the technical support person in this work. So first of all, I want you to meet my friend and longtime friend, Carmen Viola, who is an astrologer. We met here in Seattle at a meetup some number of years ago. So Carmen, hi.
Hi, Ray. Thanks for having this little conversation. I hope that our listeners will glean some information about us and about what we're doing.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea that we come. Well, after all, the company that is supposedly producing this, I say supposedly it is, called Meta Media, and the whole concept is to go beyond the media. A podcast is coming up in September called New Horizons, and we want to talk with you about that and see if we can pique your interest in who we are doing it and why we're doing it and so forth. So now, Carmen, I heard from you recently about how we had inadvertently met in a bookstore in San Francisco, what is it, 35, 40 years ago,
Quite
and
a
yet
while
met
ago,
again.
yes.
Yeah,
hmm
yeah.
And neither one of us really connected with the other at that time, but I did walk into your bookstore in San Francisco when I was wanting a printout of my astrological chart.
Back then, there was this little machine with a little roll of tape, and it would print out an astrological chart in a really square format, just rectangular
Yeah,
even,
it was sort
and it
of
was
yeah.
small.
And then it wasn't until I think 2015, so that I was searching on Meetup for an astrology group to meet up with, and I found your Meetup, and then we reconnected or connected for the first time at that point.
But we did all of this work with the meetup group, and it went really, really well. But what really changed everything was the pandemic. Nobody really wanted to come to a meetup and have to wear face masks. Carmen and I talked about, well, why don't we just try a couple of them, find something to do it through. We found Zoom, and we did it that way. I started this monthly astrological report, and she and I really worked out some of the concepts. She would advise me, and I keep talking to you about her, but she should tell you how she helped me really fine tune this monthly report. It used to be a kind of horrendously done, very amateurish.
Oh, I wouldn't say that, Ray. It was very professionally done, but I
See,
gave you just a little bit of insight as to maybe how to capture people's attention. We really had some thoughtful conversations about how to format it.
how about telling me how you became interested in astrology in the first place?
Back when I was, a teenager, there was, it's really funny that I would go be in a grocery store, and I remember seeing the little pamphlet that Sydney Omar would put out every year for the year, and it was a horoscope forecast, and I would buy those. So that was my first introduction to astrology. It wasn't until the late 70s when I had a roommate that his mother, I believed, was into astrology, and so therefore he also was interested in astrology, and he gave me a book. And I can't remember what the name of the book was, but at the very back of the book, it had instructions on how to cast your own chart. So I read through the book, and then I spent 2 or 3 days, like just from morning until nightfall, trying to cast my chart, which I did do by hand. And then it wasn't until I walked into your bookstore that I was able to see how close I was in figuring out using the mathematics to figure out how good I did. And I think I did pretty well. I was only a few seconds off with the moon. And I
So
still have
already
that
back,
paper too.
you still have, oh, don't
I
take it
still
out
have
too
that.
often.
No.
I had mine for such a long time. I have no idea where it is now. The machine was a very expensive thing. It was like about $1,300 for
Oh,
this little. Yeah, it was
well,
kind of expensive.
that was a great thing because there really was nowhere that you could get a printout of your chart at that time.
That's
In the
true.
70s. You couldn't find it. It was very difficult to find. So,
No,
you and I were both living in San Francisco at that time, and now here we are both in the Seattle area. How funny is that?
that's really funny. So my story about how I
Yes.
came into astrology. You see, I was in the Air Force, military, Vietnam era veteran, that kind of thing. I get out, and by in one way or another, I ended up in Berkeley, California, and I would go into this coffee house called the Med, meet people in there, and I met this guy, and in conversations and talking, the only thing he ever asked me was my birthday. Didn't ask for a year or anything, or time, anything like that. And I've just started to notice that he was talking to me about things he should know about. How could you do that? I asked him. And he said, astrology. Oh, I said, one of those guys. It turns out he was a Libra, a very mild mannered, beautiful, short, black ex boxer guy. And so I hung out with him for a while, and um, I began to ask him, all right, I want to prove you this is a bunch of crap. Show me the books you've been reading. Tell me about these books. And so we did. And then I went and ended up got all those books, and I read them all, and it completely blew me away. I said, wait a second. I have to try this. So I drew up my own chart, and I didn't know what time I was born. But within another 2 hour conversation, he had it down. It's the last couple of degrees of whatever it was, Aries. And then we started teaching classes together. And then he introduces me to Dane Rudhyar. How do you know Dane Rudhyar? I said, he said, well, I go to his lectures. And I told him about you. Well, what did you tell him? I said, well, at the time I was also involved in radio broadcasting at Pacifica Radio's flagship station, KPFA, in Berkeley. So I ended up being introduced to Rudhyar and all of that, and it got all the way up to Rudhyar asking me to buy this bookstore in San Francisco, like I was some sort of like big pocketed guy, And um, I said, okay, I'll look into it. So I did, and we made an arrangement, and I bought it. and then I and then I ran it and so forth. But then uh, things began to change in my life, and I ended up eventually leaving the bookstore and moving. I actually moved to Holland. I mean, the
Oh, really?
Netherlands. Lived in
I didn't
I
know
lived
that.
in The Hague.
Oh.
It was a very short while, just one 3/4 of a year in the making and in doing, but. It was, I could look at it as a huge mistake, or I could say, what did I learn? There's no place like home.
That's the case as well. I was an international flight attendant for Pan Am for a number of years and got to travel the world. And I think it made me realize how lucky we were, actually, as Americans, that there are so many things that we take for granted, generally speaking. And I felt very fortunate. I was very grateful to have that international experience. And it sounds like you did too.
Sounds like I might wonder if you weren't one of the flight attendants when we were because we flew Pan Am
Oh, that's funny.
uh, from Washington D.C. to Moscow.
I've never flown to Moscow. No, I didn't do
Darn.
that route. But it's interesting, Ray, because at the same time that I was interested in astrology, I also started practicing yoga, and that was back in the 70s when Lilia's Yoga and You was on the PBS broadcasting station. And that sort of led me into another line of work. So astrology and yoga are two of my passions. And I became a yoga teacher, studied with a specific system, and got certified, and have been teaching for quite some time, and had some other teachers underneath me as well. But and then of course that led me to meditation and some of Indian philosophy, that sort of thing. And
Something else that happened between you and me and yoga is you invited me to one of your yoga groups to give a talk or to talk about astrology, a specific level of astrology, which the astrologers call transpersonal.
yes, yeah, that was a
Anyway,
great workshop. And that video is available, so we'll make sure that we link it on the page.
yeah, yeah, right.
Yeah.
That's true. So,
So why
so
this podcast, Ray?
yeah, I mean, don't we have enough to do?
I certainly do.
Um, I have enough to do, but I always have to do as much as I can, and then I determine, well, that's as much as I can, and that's enough. I would like to ask you why you want to join up with me in this endeavor or continue our escapade uh, and branch out and put this flower, this bud, this seed out. Why?
For me, I guess it must be my sun in the 11th house. You
How
know,
many houses do you have?
I have 12. I have 12 of them. But yeah, I think it's the sun in the 11th house that I really feel that there is a specific opening at this time in our life that we have the ability to raise the consciousness of many, many people. And it needs to happen. It really, really needs to happen. And the best way to do it, I could do it, here and there with a yoga class with 5 or 10 students, once a week, but to really reach a large number of people to make the massive shift that is required, I think the podcast and providing informative topics is really important.
I agree. This whole concept of expanded states of consciousness is kind of a haughty term. But what is needed for people is to have more conscious awareness of who and what they are and what is really the world that we live in and what are the real needs and so forth. I've been doing astrological work for literally 50 years. And over these last 15 and 20 years, it seems that what the astrological chart has always said to me, the more it tells me that I need to bring more of what people need to hear out there that is it doesn't so much transcend astrology, but it's really something that if astrology were a seed, this is the flower. And so putting more petals of consciousness out there is something that is really what I wanted to do. I knew I needed to do that. And then this whole idea of a podcast creeped in and said, why not?
It wanted to be birthed. Yes, it was time.
In September, we will be launching New Horizons podcast. Please do visit newhorizonspodcast.org.